thank you for taking part in this event today, and welcome on behalf of the hosts, REDLAC, the Latin America and Caribbean Network of Environmental Funds, and CAFE, the Consortium of African Funds for the Environment. My name is James Elsmore. I'll be the MC for the week, and so you'll be seeing me over the next few days for all of the sessions that you are joining. We have a really comprehensive and exciting agenda over the next 3 days. So there'll be lots of interesting sessions, lots of speakers, and so we do hope you'll be able to join as many of those as possible. I know that there's been plenty of Zoom webinars to be taking part in, but there's been a fantastic job behind the scenes by all the organizers in putting these together. I'd also like to thank the partners for this event, the Association Forever Costa Rica, GIZ, the French Facility for Global Environment, and Island Innovation. So welcome and hello to everyone joining. Just a few housekeeping pointers. You'll see that there is a chat box open, as with most webinars that maybe you've experienced. So we do encourage you to go ahead, drop a message in the chat that says hello, who you are and where you're joining from. You can go ahead and click the panelists and attendees button and make sure that you're sending that message out to everyone. If you have questions for the speakers as we go through, then you can submit them separately under the Q&A tab. Please don't put them in the chat, and your moderator will let you know if there will be a questions taken for that speaker at the end. We also have interpretation available. So if you have interpretation, or if you'd like to listen in French or Spanish, you can click the globe icon at the bottom of your screen, and you'll see an option there to listen in a different language. So interpretation will be available for all sessions over the next 3 days, and we encourage you to use that. And a big thank you to our team of 5 interpreters who are here today to provide that service. So with that, I will hand over to our opening moderator, Zdenka Piskulic, who's the Executive Director of Forever Costa Rica and the President of REDLAC. So over to you, Zdenka.
Thank you, James, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you who are joining us from around the globe. My name is Zdenka Piskulic. I am the Executive Director of Forever Costa Rica organization, and I am also the President of REDLAC, which is the Latin American Caribbean Network of Environmental Funds. On behalf of REDLAC, we would like to welcome you to our first ever virtual Congress, which we are hosting jointly with our partner, CAFE, the Consortium of African Funds for the Environment. Together, REDLAC and CAFE work in over 30 countries with the purpose of ensuring collective action to meet and sustain conservation goals. For REDLAC, this is our 22nd Congress. Members have been meeting for over 20 years, sharing best practices, learning from each other, and growing together. This community has had a strong impact in our region in Latin America and the Caribbean, with the effective management of over 74 million hectares of land, 52 million hectares of ocean, protecting over 642 terrestrial protected areas, and over 144 marine protected areas. REDLAC funds together have dispersed over $1.4 billion and manage over $1.2 billion in endowments and sinking funds. This year, we meet virtually for the first time. As a community, we always look forward to meeting. We really feel we are a family. For us, the REDLAC meetings is something we look forward to every year, to meet each other personally and have a good time. Today, we open our doors to the world. And so we would like to welcome you for the first time, many of you, and also welcome our REDLAC members to this first virtual meeting. By having a virtual Congress, we are also opening our knowledge sharing to the world. This is an opportunity for executive directors to join, not only the executive directors, but also the different staff members from the organizations and the environmental funds represented in both REDLAC and CAFE. This is also an opportunity for the organizations that have benefited from disbursements and from grants from the REDLAC funds to learn about our work. We also have participants from the academia, from NGOs, from multilateral organizations, foundations, and others. So really, this is an opportunity to share what the REDLAC has learned and what CAFE has learned over the past 20 years with all of you. For the first time, we will have the opportunity to participate in the moment which is crucial in history. We are now facing one of the most serious economic crises, and at the same time, the data for biodiversity loss shows that we're in a critical period. In the midst of this critical period, we are also seeing governments commit to more ambition in terms of nature conservation. There is a need, thus, to be more ambitious in terms of the tools that we use and the conservation finance tools that we're able to generate to be able to fill that gap to support conservation in the long term. We need to be able to sustain the work that we do. And that is what REDLAC wants to do. We believe that through collective thinking, we can reach united action. So this is an opportunity for all of us in this Congress to learn of what environmental funds have been doing, to learn about the most recent conservation action that is being taken, and to understand how we can use this to sustain conservation over time. We can only do this together through the power of community, and there is no time to lose. We launched this Congress with the hope that through collective thinking, we can reach this. I would like to thank Karen Price, who's president of CAFE and who will be speaking in a minute, for co-hosting this event. We have learned so much from each other. Both networks together really have a global impact. I would also like to thank our supporters, the German Cooperation Agency, GIZ, the French Facility for the Environment, the David and Lucille Packard Foundation, Forever Costa Rica, and Island Innovation for this opportunity. I would also like to thank all the speakers who will be joining us and who have been preparing for this occasion. Finally, I would also like to thank Maria Luisa Hernandez, our executive coordinator, who has been the person behind the organization and coordination of this event. This, of course, is our first virtual event. We have all been learning together about how to make this a reality. We are very excited that we have over 900 participants from over 80 countries who will be participating in this event. This is really an opportunity to work together and to try to shape the world that we want for the future. Thank you very much. I would now like to leave the floor to Karen Price, who would like to also give us a few words of welcoming for this occasion. Karen is the coordinator of CAFE, the president of CAFE, the Consortium of African Funds. Karen, welcome. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Yes, good morning. Hello, bonjour, hola to everybody around the world that's joining us for this first virtual Congress of CAFE and REDLAC. As Zenka has already mentioned, this is a first for both networks, as we were not able to meet physically this year, and we came together to collaborate on this occasion to have the opportunity to continue discussing this very important topic around conservation financing and sustainable financing for conservation. So from the Consortium of African Funds from the Environment CAFE, a very warm welcome to everybody. I'd like to highlight that CAFE and REDLAC have had quite a long history of collaboration, and it actually started off with the motivational meetings in around 2010, when the REDLAC Secretariat was actually part and parcel of the motivational meetings that set up the task force in Dakar, Senegal, and set up the initial African Funds Endowment Subcommittee that later led to the formal creation of CAFE in 2011. And since then, CAFE and REDLAC have maintained a long-standing South-South relationship and collaboration. Just by way of background, CAFE currently has 16 member funds that are represented in 12 different countries, in 14 different countries in Africa, and this includes 2 transboundary parks, 2 mega diverse countries, 15 UNESCO World Heritage Sites, and about 82 Ramsar sites. So we are a growing network, and this year would have been our 10th CAFE General Assembly. However, it is our first virtual Congress, which we think has been an excellent opportunity, as Zenka has mentioned, to enable the discussion, to bring the thinkers together, the practitioners together, the scientists together, so that we can have this discussion. So as I already highlighted, for the last 8 years, REDLAC and CAFE have developed a very strong collaborative South-South relationship. by implementing joint projects to drive innovation of environmental funds. We are always challenged by the circumstances on the ground and the need to continuously mobilize resources to meet the various needs and to also maintain and sustain the various operations of conservation trust funds. Later today, we will also be hearing a little bit, in the next 3 days, we will also learn about from other partners such as the Conservation Finance Alliance that have also been very instrumental in setting up and developing practice standards for conservation trust funds and as a tool for designing, managing and monitoring and evaluation of CTFs. And we will also learn more about the 10-year review of CTFs so that we have a better understanding of the governance and impact that conservation trust funds are having on the ground and how better we can mobilize ourselves and our resources to better meet the post-2020, ambitious post-2020 goals that the globe currently faces. So just to give an example, we look forward to working continued collaboration with REDLAC on innovative financing in for environmental funds in terms of promoting knowledge and best practices and transferring peer-to-peer learning, knowledge management and online tools. And we look forward, we have recently developed a new collaboration that seeks to build on private sector financing and conservation specifically towards the 2020 biodiversity targets. At this juncture, I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank the sponsors that have made this possible, namely, as already mentioned, the French Facility for Global Environment, FFEM, GIZ, the David and Lucille Packard Foundation, and Island Innovation. So many thanks to the sponsors for making this, this Congress happen this week. Once again, thanks to technology and for bringing us all together on this day. I'm told we have about over 700 participants that have registered for this event this week. So we're look forward to a lot of interaction and engagement with everybody, but also to remind participants that this is a virtual stage and there is some functionality within the system to allow peers to have virtual networking sessions in the background. So I'd like to encourage you all to make use of that facility and that functionality so that the networking also takes place in the background and we make the most of the next 3 days. Finally, I'd just like to conclude with an African proverb, which says, if you want to walk fast, walk alone, but if you want to walk far, walk together. And I have no doubt that the next 3 days will be the beginning of a long and fruitful discussion on sustainable financing for conservation and present the much needed opportunities for networking and creating new and meaningful partnerships. And I'd like to wish us all a very successful virtual Congress. Thank you, merci, gracias.
Thank you very much, Karen. We very much look forward to continuing our partnership with CAFE. And this virtual Congress is definitely an example of what we can do when we all work together. To give us a little more feedback of the work that we're doing as networks, both CAFE and REDLAC, I would like to welcome Maria Luisa Hernandez, coordinator of REDLAC, who will be giving us a little information on the power of networking of both REDLAC and CAFE. Maria Luisa.
Thank you, Zdenka, and thank you everyone for being here today. It's an honor for us to host this event. So as we begin, I would like to make a short introduction to REDLAC and CAFE. Together, these networks join 44 conservation trust funds from 30 different countries. For the past decades, these 44 trust funds have met to generate collective impact through capacity building, knowledge management, and experience exchanges. Many of you have been part of this. As we will discuss during these 3 days, conservation trust funds have historically played an important role in ensuring permanence and financial sustainability of conservation efforts. Today, our agendas have shifted to incorporate climate change mitigation and adaptation, food security, and support for green and blue economy projects that improve the livelihoods of communities. In order to be able to support the different agendas and attract new sources of financing, environmental funds need to adopt the highest internationally recognized operational standards. REDLAC and CAFE have thus contributed to the development and update of the new practice standards for conservation trust funds, which will be launched during this Congress in partnership with the Conservation Finance Alliance. In this same path towards ensuring quality and transparency, several funds have already become accredited as implementing agencies of global funds like the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Facility, and the Adaptation Fund. REDLAC and CAFE aim to reinforce our position at international forums by organizing joint actions with members and allies, including international cooperation agencies, donors, and environmental funds from other regions. We have been learning from each other for the past decades, and today, as we open to a larger audience, we hope to share some of the knowledge that we have collectively built through the years. A spirit of trust, transparency, reciprocity, and friendship has allowed us to build collective impact and learn from each other. It has also given us tools to innovate jointly, to work as a community, and has been a platform to build long-lasting friendships. This virtual Congress is an example that conservation efforts need to adapt to the circumstances and be resilient. It is an example of the many ways in which, together, networks can build, convene, and aggregate towards achieving the new global goals and towards creating new opportunities for sustainable financing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria Luisa. I am now very honored and pleased to introduce a colleague and a friend, Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, who was elected CEO and chairperson of the Global Environment Facility just recently in June 2020. He is an internationally recognized expert on environmental policy, multilateral environmental negotiations, and financing for nature conservation. He was formerly the Costa Rican Environment and Energy Minister, where he was a pioneer in the development of payments for ecosystem services initiatives and strategies for forest restoration, ocean conservation, and decarbonization. During his 3 terms as Minister of the Environment and Energy, Costa Rica doubled the size of its forests, made its electric sector 100% clean and renewable, and consolidated a national park system that has positioned the Central American country as a prime ecotourism destination. Mr. Rodriguez has also been a longtime supporter and friend of conservation trust funds throughout the globe, and we are very honored to have him join us to give the keynote speech for the opening of our first ever virtual Congress. Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Zdenka. It is my pleasure. I'm in the middle of a rainstorm, and I hope that you all can hear me well. Do you hear me well, Zdenka? Good, excellent. And I'm really pleased to be here today, joining all of our friends that are working on the different trust funds. And you know, this year there were many reports, and as a matter of fact, we need to do kind of a context of which one is the best report that we have seen throughout this year. We got GVO5, we got the reports on the finances cost benefit of protecting 30% of the planet, and the Living Planet report from WWF, plenty reports, and one of the reports I was very much impressed was this recent report that is going to be presented in this Congress on how trust funds are doing in the last 10 years. And as I see this report, a lot of things comes into my mind. One important one is that we have kind of 3 generations of trust funds, and the context and the historical process is extremely important. And I think I was part of the, a couple of organizations in the first generation of trust funds. One very key in my career, one very key trust fund was the National Parks Foundation in Costa Rica, created in 1979. It was created by the same founders of the National Park Service that work in government. but they come to realize very early that public law, the public administrative regulations and procedures were not efficient and good enough to speed up the process by which they will create parks, create a service, and operate the park. So they created this foundation uh, um, as, um, as a way to blend the government effort through the wise use of the private law, which is way more efficient and effective. And this was very interesting because it helped Costa Ricans create and consolidate their system of protected areas. So it was independent from government. These appeal donors, and at the same time create strong ties with government, which is the foundation of many of our trust funds. And I had the pleasure to work with them for a consultant for a full year doing the land tenure analysis and helping them purchasing land, and then eventually was transferred to the government, and the system of protected areas was created. So the government saw in those early days this organization as a good financing institution, transparent, good in reporting, good in government, better than government in administration, very flexible, much flexible and efficient than government. So it was a very positive complement. Uh, the other element that Costa Ricans saw on this organization is, what we initially saw in this first generation in the late 70s, early 80s, when we didn't even call them trust funds at all, because that happened in the second generation of trust funds by the end of the 1990s, was the fact that these organizations have a continuity upon government changes. And government changes has always been a big challenge in terms of maintaining pace within the conservation efforts, but these organizations prove that they continue strongly regardless of the impacts of government, even in some cases where those government changes were abnormal and responded to human conflicts and social conflicts. The third element of that first generation was that they began not just solely responding to national policies, but also by the end of the 1980s, as we began the negotiations of the multilateral environmental agreements, they became as an important ally in the process to implement the international conservation goals. So here we were able to begin narrowing gap within national and international goals. And most importantly, the fact that these organizations had a long-term conservation focus. Key element into what was that first generation of trust funds and conservation finance organization. By the mid 1980s, I think that there was a good political positioning in many countries. There's element associated to political culture and how these trust funds do fit in that political culture. But overall, I will say that many of these organizations became a trusted partner, a trusted advisor, and were very well positioned politically as we got into the 1990s, where many elements began taking part in what I would call the second generation of trust funds, where we began looking at practice standards in terms of strengthening institutional capacities, being more transparent and efficient in their procedures, where we saw the first initiatives to create regional networks when the GF was created. So we began looking that there was processes happening in terms of mobilization of resources at the global and national levels. On the third generation of trust funds, now we're looking at sub-national efforts, and that is a very positive tendency that I do see. So in the 1990s, most of the trust funds were founded to narrow the financial gap within you know, the protected areas creation, the consolidation of system of protected areas, and they were already expanding the scope of their vision beyond biodiversity conservation and protected areas. Here, by the late 1990s, we saw how the trust fund began to have a human face in their investment and their portfolio, and that was an element that continues to build. Local communities, indigenous communities became an important partner, an important institutional objectives, and that was an element that I wanted to strongly highlight. So the fact that they have been working on narrowing the financial gap is a key element, and I will talk a little bit about that, you know, when I get into the third generation of trust funds, because I think that that's a key element in the context of what is happening. By the early 2000s, we saw the first trust funds that began to move their land experience into the ocean, and now we see a lot of trust funds and financial mechanisms that are being developed on the marine realm at the country and regional level. One very close to my work, my previous work in the government of Costa Rica was Pacifico, that is working as the trust fund for the Eastern Tropical Pacific countries in the Baloyoco corridor, and that's an excellent example. I think that we've been very successful in migrating our, you know, experiences and objectives from the land to the ocean, and I see a lot of interest and support for trust funds to really engage on marine and oceanic issues, as this becomes one of the biggest challenges that we have. We have had trust funds that has worked for 2 decades on land, and now I see trust funds really working on this respect, and organizations like the GF, Pew, Conservation International, and many others are really supporting initiatives that aim to the seascapes, as we were able to be quite successful in achieving our institutional goals and targets on the marine conservation. So I think in the context of what we have seen in the last 10 years, marine is going to grow exponentially, and that is great. But we need to really focus on 4 elements, or 3 or 4 elements that I think is important. One, we need to continue building local capacities, and this is a key element of the work of the trust funds. We need to help governments do many different actions to improve governance and in policy development for the implementation of the conservation goals and targets. If we saw the outcome of GBO 5, which is the assessment of the implementation or lack of good implementation of the Aichi targets, when I see that reports, I see all over the place lack of policy coherence, lack of resource mobilization, and the need to improve the policy and legal frameworks. And this is an element I hope that we can really address at the scale and with the depthness that we needed in the post-2020 framework negotiation for the CBD. At the end of the day, I think that in terms of the Aichi target, we did progress in many of them, very little progress. And progress was limited basically by the lack of mobilization of resources from all sources and the need to generate more policy coherence. It doesn't make any sense. When I say policy coherence, what do I mean? I look to target number 3, where it says basically target number 3, Aichi targets tell us that we need to go from perverse incentives into positive ones. We did very little progress on that. There is not a science that can help us and guide us on how to address this issue, but it doesn't make any sense for the GF or for any other fund to put a lot of resources in conservation efforts in a country that is putting 100 times more resources in activities that generates a loss of biodiversity, loss of ecosystems, or contribute to climate change. Policy coherence is an element that we need to understand. It's kind of a new kind of a angle to the work that we do, and trust funds needs to concentrate on those three elements: building more local capacities, improve governance, and policy coherence and policy development. We already been doing that for many years, and probably we don't earmark or see that as such. But if we are able to really focus on those efforts and define specific outcomes and outputs, I think that we can help, because at the end of the day, and you all know this very well because of the many reports that we have seen in the last 3 months on resource mobilization and finance and the finances of biodiversity. The global gap for nature conservation is a huge one. It's around $700 billion. We are investing around 80 to $100 billion, and the need is around $800 billion. So there's a huge gap there. How do we do that? Well, we got plenty of options, and we need to concentrate on many of them. It is not just improving the scale of mobilization, which is going to help us. It's a combination of mobilization of resources from all sources, particularly domestic sources, and here trust funds do play a major role, and the other is policy coherence. We shouldn't be investing at the scale that we are in activities that generates biodiversity loss and climate change. According to UNDP, annually we invest 144 times more money in activities that generates tropical deforestation than what we invest in forest conservation. So that's a very strong fact that we need to understand, and governments and trust funds need to really close down that policy gap and be able to be more coherent. And I think that the trust funds has done a great job in the past in improving policy frameworks, legal frameworks, but need to really focus on many of these elements. The second element that I wanted to talk about on the things that we should be doing in order to create the proper conditions so we can support countries implementing the post-2020 framework is that trust funds need, even though they were founded through an endowment and manage multiple programs account, and they do a lot of short-term, financing, pass-through funds, and sinking funds. I tend to believe that this is the moment that we concentrate in a new generation of accounts, program accounts that has to do with payment for environmental services, just to name one. I strongly believe, and if I see the experience of FONAFIFO in Costa Rica, where FONAFIFO, a private public fund that managed around $32 million based on a tax on fossil fuel and adjustment on water fees, is able to do an investment in paying for the environmental services provided by private owners of forests outside protected areas within biological corridors, which is key. So this is a good example. I see the example in Belize with PAT, and also Biofund in Mozambique are both good examples on how funds has arranged with governments on mechanism for sustainable finance, and this is great. But I tend to believe that we need to really move into that direction. So PES is important in water and carbon, but at the same time, we need to understand that we have failed big time at the international level to mobilize resources around REDD+. And even though this has been a government to fund or a government to government relationship, I will like very much to see trust funds discussing what is their role in national PS and their role in REDD+. I feel very frustrated that 15 years after we had that landmark decision in UNFCCC, we haven't been able to mobilize resources for REDD+ at the scale that we wanted, and that is why we're losing forests, because we're not we are not matching the cost of opportunity of doing cattle ranching and other activities in forested areas. And since the international price for carbon forest is so low, there is not a economic incentive or benefit for those who needs an income. And I think that is important. But at the same time that trust funds can create new funding methods like the one I said, PS. I think that insurance instruments is another one. Biodiversity offset is another one. Of course, biodiversity offset is a very delicate issue, but I think there's a role for trust funds in that. And yes, of course, biodiversity offset is that last option out of the line in terms of avoiding and mitigating, biodiversity offset is there. Blended finance, something that is already being worked with many of them. And I tend to believe that that need to really be upscale. Impact investment as another one. And yes, I just mentioned Red Plus, but also when I talk about PS, I'm a strong believer that countries need to realize that they need to set carbon taxes at the national level. The good example of Colombia and Costa Rica are the examples that we need to follow up on. And I think that those are the new funding methods that the trust funds can develop so they can continue, having their multiple program accounts, short-term funding, and even sinking funding, which will give them, that's financial sustainability, which is important. In terms of effective asset management, the trust funds has been doing great. More to be done, more to be done. So trust can be a strong element, and I think that one element that I saw in their report that you're going to present today is that the endowments are not well invested. And need to put an eye on that. I tend to believe that we need to make the best out of the financial opportunities. And even though I recognize that there are some big challenges associated to that, this report and other reports call the attention for the need to better manage in terms of efficiency and returns those endowment funds. I would like to finalize by saying three things which are important. One is the role of trust funds in COVID, in the pandemic. And I think that there's very interesting cases. Many countries, many protected area systems, many communities, and many trust funds do rely strongly on the tourist economy. And everybody has been struck and impact big time. And we need to be able, how do the trust funds do support and do some relief funding into key stakeholders and key investments. And I've seen that Biofund in Mozambique has doing very interesting efforts in supporting rangers and stakeholders during the COVID, having a good plan on how the funds can help our partners and stakeholders in this respect is important. And my final comment here is that one element that I would like to see in this third generation of trust funds is the understanding that they need to support the economic transformation and transition. And I'm including here, obviously, the decarbonization processes that we need to see all over the planet. So understanding that everything that trust funds are doing not only responds directly or indirectly to the SDGs, but also understanding that you had a responsibility primarily on the green agenda to help us do the transition from this neoclassic irrational economic model into, this desired circular economy is a key element. So in conclusion, I tend to believe that COVID-19, the pandemic, provide us an unprecedented opportunity for the transformation of the human interaction with nature. Because It has a huge potential for future pandemic from zoonotic diseases ties to, deforestation, habitat loss, wildlife trade, and ecosystem collapse. In addition, I will say that this decade will bring extraordinary new challenges to the anticipated collapse of ecosystem functions in certain areas and increased stress from climate-driven changes across the planet. As these new challenges affect our planet, governments will become increasingly strained in their ability to respond, but will be more open to mainstream biodiversity in more sustainable long-term investment and working with all kinds of stakeholders. And here I see a big responsibility and role for the trust funds. So while the global leaders struggle with, health, social, and economic repercussions of this pandemic, there is an opportunity to transform future infrastructure investment to support climate mitigation, adaptation, and link the environmental restoration conservation with economic development, with human health and food security. With the climate stress increasing, there will be a greater need for political decision and financial allocations to tackle economic impact and vast human migration pressures. So even though the trust funds is not a silver bullet, they are an important contributors to innovation solutions to our planet that needs desperately options and ways forward. So I tend to believe that trust funds will be a crucial actor in convening those capable organizations and alliances and developing financial mechanisms needed to mobilize resources to protect, restore, to fund, and to defund deforestation and pollution. I thank you so much, Zdenka, for the opportunity to address our good friends here. And I wish you a very successful event. And I would like to encourage everybody that has been working for so many years in the finance of conservation to keep on doing this, that we will have a great opportunity to really do major changes in the next decade. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Minister Rodriguez. Thank you so much for your words and for also showing us the evolution of conservation trust funds over the past more than 20 years, almost 30 years, as conservation trusts have evolved to seek to meet the new challenges. Mr. Rodriguez, if possible, we have 10 more minutes and we have a few questions. I would like to address one of these questions to you because I think it is very pertinent to what you have been discussing in terms of the future challenges for conservation trust funds and in general for conservation organizations and for all of us seeking to meet the new challenges, as you mentioned, with the big gap that we have in terms of financing. And this is a question about how would you see private investment, especially with return component, coming into biodiversity conservation? And what would be the necessary regulating requirements? And this is a very pertinent question as we will be discussing the involvement of private sector as a new source, also an important source of funding for biodiversity conservation. If we could speak to this question, Mr. Rodriguez.
Yes, thank you, Zdenka. Yeah, we've been talking about private sector engagement for quite some time, more than a couple of decades on different fronts, and many progress has been done. Nevertheless, we haven't gone from, social responsibility policies, high philanthropism, and good engagement throughout blended finance and other mechanisms into what I would call the big leagues of private engagement in sustainability. And even though all of this has been done and many companies have been working many different fronts, particularly on greening up the supply chain, we won't have the private sector right next to the sustainability process until governments are able to really set the right policies, standards, and procedures so we can level the economic playing field, and nature conservation, climate adaptation, mitigation becomes an attractive economic activity. Um, and just let me give you a couple of examples of that. If we keep on having national accounting system that doesn't reflects the negative externalities of the production and consumption system, we'll never do the leap forward at the scale that we need it. If we keep on taxing the very positive things that we do in our societies and don't tax the negative externalities, we will never be able to level the economic playing field. So this is a key element. Yes, the private sector is key. Yes, the private sector is on board. But at the end of the day, we need to really understand that it won't be until government set the right policies, standards, and procedures that we can do the impact at the scale that we want it. Of course, we can work a lot in terms of financing conservation with the capital market and with the financial and banking sector, and this is happening more and more. But still, I tend to believe that there's a lot of work to be done on the public policy sector. As we do that, we need to generate a lot of reliable mechanisms that can track information and data, and this is key. Not just in terms of how much the private sector mobilizes, but in terms of how much of the local domestic budgeting and financing. Most governments at this point, they don't have a biodiversity or climate expenditure review. Governments doesn't know how much they are investing in nature conservation. Most government doesn't know what is their financial needs, and most government doesn't have a plan on how they narrow down that financial gap, and that is key. That financial gap will be narrowed down through many mechanisms, and the role of private sector is key. But the role of private sector or the participation of the private sector won't be at the scale that we need it if we don't have the proper policies, standards, and procedures from the public sector.
As a follow-up to that question, there is a question here. It says, do you see any role for multilateral banks and international financial institutions to leverage private funds for financing the environmental agenda?
Yeah, definitely. And this is not new to them. They've been doing this for many, many years. And of course, as multilateral banks began to streamline their sustainability investments, we will see, more and more positive investment from the private sector. Nevertheless, based on the pandemic and the economic recession, I tend to believe that this is the moment where multilateral and development banks needs to do a broader and bigger engagement with countries. I remember back in the 1990s, many of these multilateral agencies helped countries to the structural adjustment and plans to prepare our economies to globalization and free trade. That was very successful in some countries, in other countries not that much, not because of the structural adjustment rather than the institutions and the policy systems. But I tend to believe that based on the pandemic, the economic recession, the threats associated to the biodiversity collapse and climate change, this is the moment where multilateral agencies should be thinking on green adjustment structural plans, where you can mix in a very strong manner the short-term needs to stimulate economies, generate jobs, with the need to bring up the green recovery of our economies.
Thank you. And we have one last question for you, Mr. Rodriguez. And this is a different type of question. It says, governments and ministries globally range from need to control trust funds to consider them totally NGOs. not obligated to receive support from the government. At the political level, what do you consider the best inroad for trust funds, especially those arguing for autonomy with government support and participation?
Well, what a great question, and this has been an existential question for all trust funds in the last 30, 40 years. Um, when I was going through my notes, I was addressing a little bit about this issue. The independence from government, autonomy, plus the strong ties with government. How do you generate a balance? And unfortunately, in many of the countries that trust funds work, political stability and consistency and coherence is an issue. That is why, from the environmental institutional point of view, it is important for trust funds to really strengthen and develop capacities at the national level. But we have seen all kind uh, of events throughout times that really worries us. What happened in Ecuador a few years ago is it's a good sign of how fragile they may be. And even in our Costa Rica, I remember that there was a movement in Congress not long ago saying that all funds provided from abroad to conservation organizations will be considered for all purposes public funds. And that has a high implication. There were politicians willing to have control of those funds. Because why? Because there's a high political interest. So having a balance on this is something critical and very differently. Nevertheless, I see more and more private-public partnerships being behind the governance structure of many of these conservation trust funds. And that gave us some level of political resilience, but we will always be subject to political changes, to political pressures. So the way by which I believe that we can be more resilient is moving towards these private-public partnerships, which has proven to be very interesting. And I know a lot of cases that even though it is challenging in terms of political stability in the representation of those boards, this gives us more of a political resilience that is needed in many cases. But we will always be subject to politicians and policy changes.
Yes. Well, thank you. I think that is one of the issues that conservation trust funds struggle with constantly. And because conservation trust funds seek sustainability, sustainability is not only financial, it is also political, it is also social. And so definitely it is something that conservation trust funds struggle with. And thank you for your insight. Thank you so much, Mr. Rodriguez, for all of your support, for joining us today for this keynote, for your insight, and also for being a longtime supporter of conservation trust funds. As your keynote addressed, you have been involved also in the creation of conservation trust funds from the beginning, and the GEF has been a very strong supporter of conservation trust funds. Many of them have been created with the support of the GEF, and we thank you and the GEF for the support you have given conservation trust funds. And we look forward to continuing to work with you in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Zdenka. And the GF will continue to be a strong partner, a strong ally of all trust funds. We need to really work closer together to make strong cases to our donors on how successful we've been in terms of mobilizing resources and being to impact positively the agenda of nature conservation. Gracias, Zdenka.
Thank you very much. Bye. James, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Zdenka, and to all of those fantastic speakers. A really interesting session. For those of you who have just joined, that was a keynote speech from Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, the CEO of the GEF, and we'll be going now into session 2. And we're actually running even slightly ahead of schedule, which is fantastic. So really appreciate those insightful speeches. For those of you who weren't here at the start, my name is James Ellsmore. I'll be the MC for this week, and will be helping out. And an hour ago, I did a quick welcome on behalf of the hosts who we've just heard from, and also all of the sponsors. But I did just want to remind you about a few different features that you should use. So as we've already mentioned, there is a chat feature, which I know that plenty of people have been using. Please do make sure that when you send a message over the chat, you click the blue box that will show panelists and attendees. And so if you want everyone to see your message, it will be default sent to panelists. So make sure you select panelists and attendees so everyone can see your session. For the next session, we will be having a section for Q&As, and so Q&As are already coming in, but you'll notice when you go to the Q&A section, other guests and speakers are able to add comments to those questions and also upvote them. So the highest number of votes will appear at the top. So feel free to upvote other people's questions to save you asking the same question over again. And we'll be using that same feature throughout the week. We'll also be recording this session, and it's being live streamed on Facebook. So hello to everyone watching on the record. And if you can't attend any sessions this week, all of the sessions will be available for later viewing, although of course we encourage you to attend as many of them live as possible to make use of the chat and networking features. So I will now invite the next moderator to take the floor, Melissa Moy, who is the Senior Director for Conservation Finance Program of the World Wildlife Fund. So thank you, and over to you, Melissa.
Great, thanks, James. It's a real pleasure to be here with everyone from REDLAC and CAFE and beyond. The first 10-year review of conservation trust funds found that funds are much more than financing mechanisms. And of course, as Carlos Manuel Rodrigo said, this is still true and more. This community has grown in influence over the years, largely due to the commitment, engagement, and strong performance of funds around the world. And conservation trust funds are uniquely positioned to contribute to the global goals with their ability to act as a bridge with governments, donors, investors, and local communities. Our panel will reflect on past experience while looking forward to new roles that require funds to change the way they operate. In this panel, Brian O'Donnell will help to set the stage for our discussion. We'll then address prepared questions and have close to half an hour for an open Q&A with the audience. Please go ahead and post your questions in the Q&A as they come up and identify your name, organization, and location. We're also happy to respond to questions submitted in English, Spanish, or French. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speakers today.
Sorry, Melissa, I'm just going to interrupt you quickly. This is James again. Quite a few people in the chat are saying there is no sound. I can hear you perfectly, and so if people are unable to hear you, then they'll need to select interpretation. So just wanted to let you know that. There's not much we can do about it now, and I'll make sure to write a message in the chat for those people also to make sure that they turn off their interpretation. Sorry, please go ahead.
Okay, sorry about that. Next slide, please. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. I think the panel is well known to many of you, and they've been terrific supporters of conservation trust funds over the years. Adriana Gonçalves Moreira currently manages the Amazon Sustainable Landscapes Program as Program Manager for the World Bank. ASL is a joint effort by 7 Amazon basin countries to improve integrated landscape management and ecosystem conservation in the region. She's worked extensively in sustainable development and climate change, leading a series of large environment and rural development projects in Latin America for more than 20 years. Tom Dillon oversees the Pew Charitable Trust, its environmental portfolio, which includes a broad array of land and ocean initiatives. But before joining Pew, Tom was Senior Vice President at the World Wildlife Fund, where he directed land, freshwater, and marine programs in the US and abroad. He led WS initiatives to establish, fund, and protect in perpetuity 150 million acres of the Brazilian Amazon. While living in Asia, he was a leader in creating WWF's Mekong program. Jason Cole is Program Officer at the Margaret A. Cargill Philanthropies, responsible for developing and managing the philanthropy's environmental grant-making efforts in selected regions around the world. Jason previously worked for the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, focusing on the Andes Amazon Initiative, and managed the foundation's role in the Forever Costa Rica initiative. Jason began his work in the environmental arena at Conservation International, where he helped launch the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund. Brian O'Donnell is the director of the Campaign for Nature, an effort to increase global targets and financing for protected areas under the Convention on Biological Diversity. He has helped build international support for a global target of protecting at least 30% of the Earth's land and seas by 2030. Brian has many years of experience in land conservation in the US, serving as executive director of the Conservation Lands Foundation and working for Trouts Unlimited and the Wilderness Society. I'd now like to invite Brian to set the stage for us for this panel discussion. Please remember to go ahead and submit your questions. Next slide for Brian.
We are unable to hear Brian.
Okay. Brian, if you wouldn't mind signing in again, I think we have a technical issue. In the meantime, while we're waiting for Brian to sign in again, I'd like to invite one of the speakers to address one of our most interesting questions, which I believe was raised by Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, which is the question of funds encountering new challenges. And Adriana, can you please introduce yourself a little bit more and address the question of, in your opinion, how can funds become more resilient, or how are funds already resilient, and based on all of your experience with funds around the world? Adriana?
Thanks, Melissa. I hope everyone can hear me. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. So many friends on the screen and in the list of participants. I have had in my professional career the privilege to participate in the design and initial capitalization of several CTFs. And I think we have learned a lot with the CTFs about resilience, because at least from the sample that I have, you know, most of them are still alive and very much increasing their actions and support to conservations. In many areas, I think the CTFs have become the lifeline, the main supporting system, funding, not only with funding, but also with a lot of technical assistance, because Carlos Manuel gave us a tour de force on the history of the CTFs, and he mentioned already some strong elements for this resilience. You know, a lot of these funds have suffered and are currently suffering stress tests, very strong stress tests, particularly due to changes in governments and unstable economic and social environments. And I think the design of the funds have much to do with the resilience. So as a donor, I always look at particularities in the design that give me hints on the long-term prospect for these institutions. One thing that's very important is governance, establishing a strong governance. A board is something that you create, but you have to sort of cultivate and steer over time. And a good board is crucial, is in the heart of this resilience, where you can have different support across society. And I think a diverse board is very important, with representation from different sectors. The ability of the funds to create partnerships. Usually these funds establish with a partnership with government, but it's a public-private partnership. So I think the public part is very important in establishing alliances with communities, establishing alliances with subnational governments, not only national governments, establishing alliances with private sector, as was mentioned many ways as this new frontier, and also with civil society as a role. I think transparency and the ability to diversify their sources of funding. Also, I sometimes think, and these institutions have evolved as service providers. Many of the trust funds that I have had the opportunity to participate in the creation, later on, we have used as executive agencies, implementing agencies for the same projects with governments on conservation of biodiversity that I have done at the bank, for example, and we have done at the bank. So I think these three elements of good governance, strong board, engagement of several partners, actually to create a political constituency that supports these trust funds, in societies in general. And transparency, and I think the building trust with the donors through efficiency and delivering the results that the donors are after. I think I can give a lot of examples, and I have had the opportunity to work directly with some strong and very good funds in Latin America and Africa. And Carlos Manuel gave us a long and very interesting history of these many generations. I think I started in the second generation, not the first. But what I see today is a diversification on the strategies of these funds. And I think I see a great opportunity now as the world is opening the eyes to the importance of linking the health of the planet with the health of society. And I think that the funds have a key role to play on this, as I mentioned, as service providers, but also as adding a lot of technical expertise. In many countries that I work, and particularly in my short experience in Africa has shown the resilience of the funds and they being the center for action in biodiversity in their own countries, such as in Bio-Guinea, in Guinea-Bissau, and Mosbio in Mozambique. And I feel very privileged to be part of this history. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Adriana. I'd like to ask you a follow-up question because, of course, you've been a real leader across the Amazon, and some of the oldest funds in the REDLAC network are Fumbio and Profanampe. And I'm wondering whether you see a movement towards looking at sustainable finance at a regional level. Would you care to just give us and of course I've forgotten Colombia, which has a new initiative under development. But could you just give us a flavor of your work in this area?
Well, we have experimented and successfully actually with what we call finance for permanence. Costa Rica para Sempre was the first example. We followed up with that with the ARPA fund, where we we converted the fund from an endowment through a sinking fund with this closing mechanism that was, aka the Wall Street business deals. And we have learned a lot, and we are applying this learning to Herencia Colombia, where we have the private part in Patrimônio Natural, the fund we work in Colombia, and also with Herencia Colombia and Patrimônio del Peru, in the fund we work in Peru with Profanampe. But also Fundo Mexicano, for example, we have worked with establishment of regional funds that's why when I mentioned that part of this stability and this diversification for resilience is also to work at the subnational level. That sometimes, you know, we have issues, and now as we're going through in Brazil right now, with a complete change in policy at the federal level, at the national level, but we have a strong alliances at the subnational level that allow, for example, the ARPA program to thrive under, you know, some kind of inhospitable conditions. So I think all of those elements are important. Carlos Manuel mentioned this thing, there's importance to tap into PES schemes, but also in RED Plus. I think Bill Guinea gave us a strong example in their tapping of RED Plus voluntary market for generating funds for blue carbon for the marine protected areas. Here in Brazil, we created a new fund for marine protected areas housed in Fumbio, and that is looking at these options and has helped in this project that created this fund under Fumbio, helped increase the surface of protected areas, marine protected areas in Brazil from 1.5% to 26% of the ZE, you know, the economic exclusion zone. So I think all those elements of the funds are directly contributing to the global benefits and the global goals. I think that 30 by 30 is a unique opportunity for the CTFs. Why? Because they are the stronger institutions we have today behind the national systems of protected areas. So I think these should be in the core of any strategies that we are now thinking 2030 strategies. And for the CTFs, I think that's something that deserves a separate discussion on how to position the CTFs for the 30 by 30 goals and challenge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adriana. I understand we're still having some technical difficulties, so I'm going to use a bit of adaptive management in trying to make this work. So I may ask Adriana, who's apparently the only one everyone can hear properly. I'm going to ask Adriana to help me out. And so if you could just let Brian know that we're ready for his presentation, and Jake, you can put his presentation up. I know we're all among friends here, so let's just do the best that we can. Brian, if you could begin, that would be terrific. And Jake, if you can put up the presentation as well.
Brian, can you hear me, Brian, or Jake, or Jason, Tom?
I can hear everything fine, but I'm not hearing Brian.
Yeah, I can't hear Brian as well. Wow, you have a great background, Jason, as always.
So I now see Brian.
Hi everyone, sorry, this is James. Really apologize for these technical issues. It seems specifically with Melissa, Brian, and Tom's accounts. So we're going to resend you personalized links that we'll ask you to rejoin with. It's some error with the interpretation. But it seems that Jason isn't having any issues, so maybe if he could go in the meantime.
Yeah,
Jason,
but the way this was designed, Melissa is asking the questions. So if anyone is not everyone is hearing Melissa, so I think that's a challenge.
Yeah. Jason, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay, terrific. So Jason, I think it would be great if you could just give a quick introduction of yourself. And then I'd like you to describe what role you think CTFs can play in addressing new challenges such as the global pandemic.
Happy to. And good morning, Melissa. And boy, the REDLAC family, it's been about a decade since I feel like I'm coming back to a family reunion after deserting a family for a decade. So really nice to be back with people. Hopefully most of you can hear. Also great to see my team of panelists who are colleagues and friends from a long, long time. I think most of you within the Redlac family probably remember me from my days when I was at the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. That was also when I was deeply involved with Zdenka and several other partners in helping craft the Forever Costa Rica deal. And at the same time, we were able to provide some direct capacity building support to Redlac, as many of the funds were trying to build capacity around diversifying their sources of funding, which from what I recall went really well. A lot of the funds expanded their portfolios in a variety of innovative ways, and that continues to happen today. So really great to be back in the Redlac fold. While I've been away, I've been at the Margaret A. Cargill Philanthropies now for the past 10 years. And while our focus is mainly on supporting community-based conservation initiatives around the world, we have been able to draw on some discretionary resources to stay involved in this space of conservation finance and financing of protected area systems. So we contributed to ARPA for Life in Brazil. We were involved in the recently closed deal in Peru, Patrimonio Natural del Perú. And we also provided support to a similar model in the marine space in what's called Blue Abadi in Indonesia. So while it's not our core work, I've managed to sneak this body of work that I'm so passionate about into what we do. So great to be back. I wish we were in a warm, sunny place rather than me as I prepare for Minnesota's cold winter coming. As beautiful as it looks, Adriana, it's going to get really cold really soon. But Melissa, to your question, Carlos Manuel, I think, really touched on this well in his opening remarks. So I'm going to build on his great opening. But the question of whether conservation trust funds can play a role facing new challenges, I think there are many. And it was touched on that obviously the COVID pandemic, for better or for worse, has the potential to help mainstream some of the important connections between people and nature. And with that, the opportunity to better link environmental conservation with economic development, with human health, with food security, I think is more obvious now than ever. So that offers a real opportunity for conservation trust funds to continue to expand their purview, to go beyond the traditional conservation specific focus that many began with, particularly as doors open for more integrated approaches to conservation, health, and economic development. Those other fields and the flows of funding from those fields can take advantage of the strong institutions that exist in many of the conservation trust funds. So as we heard, very sophisticated operational standards have been built within these funds. They already have diversified the mix of financial resources and streams that they manage. They're sophisticated investment managers. The funds are professionals at delivering through a whole series of instruments. They're grant makers, they're loan officers, they're impact investors, they're incubators of community-led enterprises. And I think more and more, they are also playing an important role as facilitators or bridges between public and private stakeholders. They're savvy negotiators in a lot of cases, and they can engage effectively in the policy arena. So all of this offers the opportunity for conservation trust funds, in my mind, to serve well beyond the conservation community, while at the same time still delivering on their conservation outcomes, in fact, enhancing those. So they can become really important vehicles for supporting the financial management of new integrated approaches that support the critical links between environment, health, and long-term economic development. But I'm not saying that it's just for the funds to orchestrate all of this. I think many of us on the panel are in the funding community. We have to recognize the importance of integrated approaches across sectors. Too often we are siloed in the way we look at a lot of this work. And we need to understand better that the environmental outcomes that we're striving for are going to be maximized if we consider them in light of the closely linked issues like community health and economic development. we're finding, yes, integration makes things a little more complicated. It demands a diversity of ideas and approaches, but ultimately, I think far greater and lasting impacts are going to be achieved if we can plan and act in a more integrated fashion. And if the funding community opens its eyes to working this way, I see the conservation trust funds being a really critical actor that is ready to step in and help facilitate that effort. They're the perfect vehicle for channeling both public and private funding from a more integrated set of sources and toward a more integrated set of environmental and social outcomes. So I think the opportunity for conservation trust funds is more ripe today than possibly ever before. I'll stop there, Melissa, and let you move on with the others and see what questions that might generate.
Great, thanks so much, Jason. I'd like to turn again to Brian now. Let's hope that the technical issues have been resolved.
Sure. Can you guys hear me this time? Is that working better? All
That's
right.
terrific.
Hooray. Okay. Well, now we'll try to share my screen and see if we can make that work and do some of these slides. Okay. Okay, so thanks everyone. Apologize again for technical issues, and I'm pleased to be joining all of you. I was fortunate enough to attend a REDLAC meeting in person when you gathered in the Dominican Republic, and look forward to meeting all of you who are on the line from CAFE at some point. As many of you know, late last month, there was the first ever UN Biodiversity Summit. And in the lead up to that summit, there was a number of critically important reports on financing for biodiversity that I think can be especially important to conservation trust funds as you make the case for increased resources and as you think about how those resources can be distributed and really help to protect biodiversity in your countries. The first one of these that you may have seen some headlines on came from the Paulson Institute, the Nature Conservancy, and Cornell University. And it found what some said was a mind-boggling or eye-watering number of a financial gap of $700 billion that to many can result in how are we ever going to close that gap. But if you look at the specifics of that report, and I encourage you to go online and read that report, the first part of it was that we can close that gap first by cutting back on the harmful subsidies that we're doing in the fossil fuel and agriculture sector. So half of that money can be closed just by redistributing the current funding that we do away from areas that harm nature into areas that conserve nature. But one of the most important parts for conservation trust funds that the report raised was it recommended a process. It recommended that each country convene a national biodiversity finance strategy. This is an opportunity that conservation trust funds will be at the forefront of. And I hope that all of you follow the Convention on Biological Diversity process and recognize that this target may be one that they land on, that they recommend that each country do initiate this conservation biodiversity finance plan. You are positioned better than anyone in the world. You recognize the key areas of conservation finance that need to happen in your countries. You know the key players, you know the key sources of funding, and you know the shortfalls. So I want to encourage all of you in conservation trust funds to start thinking now about how you may involve yourselves in those national biodiversity finance plans and how your conservation trust fund can benefit as one of the main sources to both encourage those revenues as well as to recommend the right sources and right places where those funds should be distributed. There were also a number of other reports that came out. McKinsey and Associates came out with a report on the value of nature conservation that I think will be important for all of you if you go to your finance ministers and others and talk about that conservation of nature is not a drain on society, but actually a way to enhance economic value within your countries. They found major contributions of nature conservation in terms of job creation, obviously in terms of addressing climate change, habitat for threatened species, and for tourism dollars and other economic returns. So I would recommend looking at that McKinsey study, as well as a study that Campaign for Nature and others convened that showed that If we protect 30% of the planet by 2030, the economic benefits will be a return of about 5 to 1 in terms of the costs. So these are great new resources that we can use to finance ministers to show that the investing in protected areas, investing in biodiversity conservation is a net benefit, not a drain on economies. And this is something that all of you in conservation trust funds can and should use these new reports. But we're also at a really major point. Carlos Manuel mentioned that their development banks will play an increasing role of working together. For the first time in November 12th of this year, the world's leading public development banks will be gathering for a summit to try to align their finance. This is a great opportunity for biodiversity finance to become at the forefront of development. I would recommend that REDLAC and CAFE write a letter to the attendees of these summits and talk about the biodiversity financing gap, how these banks need to play a role, and how conservation trust funds stand ready to, once that financial gap is closed, to help implement that. This is a great opportunity for conservation trust funds to engage, and this could lead to significantly more financing for development that goes towards biodiversity conservation. They'll also be talking a lot about green debt relief, and I know some of your conservation trust funds were established because of debt for nature swaps. So we could be at the cusp of another renaissance, a new opportunity for significant new debt swaps for nature, and conservation trust funds. Existing ones can benefit from that, and new ones can be created. So you will again be at the forefront of some important global discussions on biodiversity finance. We know that this year we've seen delays in the Convention on Biological Diversity and the climate change COP. But these delays, I think, in many ways give us an opportunity to position conservation trust funds to do two things. One is to ensure that we are making the case for increased biodiversity finance. As Carlos Manuel mentioned at the beginning in his opening remarks, the finance has really lagged the policy. We've heard a lot about 30 by 30. We've heard a lot about other potential targets in the Convention on Biological Diversity, but we have not heard about how those things are going to be financed. So CTFs, as you are well connected with your environment ministries, with your finance ministries, with the media in your countries, you can make the case that finance needs to accompany these global goals. And this is going to be essential to reaching a global goal, a global deal in Kunming in 2021. Additionally, on the climate change front, we're increasingly hearing that a larger percentage of climate finance needs to go towards nature. In fact, just last week, the UK Environment Minister said that they are going to increase the percentage of UK funding that goes towards nature conservation. And the French Development Agency had said that it's going to increase its percentage of climate funding to about 30% of its climate funding going towards nature. So if this happens across the globe with the major donor countries who fund climate finance, we will see a huge inflow of potentially new dollars going to the nature area of climate. Are conservation trust funds well positioned for this? Are we ready if we get that flow? I think you can do two things. You can be advocates to say that yes, we do need that increased percentage of climate funds coming towards nature, but we also need to be positioned to show that conservation trust funds are ready and effective. I know that many of you have struggled to become certified and find that some of these multilateral funds can direct those funds to you because they can become very burdensome and cumbersome to receive those funds. So I would recommend, as your associations of REDLAC and CAFE, that you get in touch with the GEF and you get in touch with the Green Climate Fund and say, we are in both a climate and biodiversity emergency. We need to make sure it doesn't take us years to have these certification processes so that these funds can get to the ground. This needs to happen quickly, and encourage them to find ways to more quickly get that money down to the ground to you who are doing that critical work in your countries. So this can be a major influx of funds for conservation trust funds, but we need to make sure that we're structurally ready and that we are advocating for this opportunity that is right before us. This is really potentially a super year, or now it was going to be a super year of 2020. Now it's super years because we're moving into 2021. Conservation trust funds, I would just to sum up, can be at the forefront of this, but they need to be strong advocates for a global goal. There aren't enough voices right now talking about the finance part of this. I know your job has been to implement things on the ground in your countries, but we really need your voices in the Convention on Biological Diversity, in the media, that finance needs to accompany bold policy goals. And we need you to be ready so that if we do succeed in having a great new global deal in Kunming, or we see the climate change COP start to focus and recognize the true nature, that nature is at the forefront of climate change and we need to better fund it, that conservation trust funds are well positioned to receive and then effectively spend those resources. So I'm going to turn it back over to Melissa.
Great, thanks so much, Brian. I really appreciate that call to action. I'd like to now turn to Tom and ask Tom to give a flavor for his work on conservation finance, and also to address the question of what role conservation trust funds can play in meeting the global goals. Tom, over to you.
Thank you, Melissa. Can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, great. I missed the first 20 minutes, so I apologize, but I also admire Redlac and Cafe for taking this on during a pandemic and figuring out the technological aspects. So little glitches are to be expected, I would think. But it's good to be with all of you. Buenos dias, bom dia, bonjour. Hello, all of you English speakers. And I don't know what Melissa said in her introduction about me, but I have worked on and off on conservation finance for many years. And I find that it's something that keeps coming back in my life. It's a bit like an obsession that, and once the bug has bit you, you never really want to avoid it again. And that, and I remember the first conservation finance arrangement that I worked on. It was, as all of you know, when you've created them, just very difficult, right? There are lots of ups and downs, and the political winds are supporting you for a while, and then the political winds go against you. The raising the money, you have the momentum, and then you seem like you don't, and then you regain it. There are all kinds of hurdles. And I said to my boss at the time, who some of you know, Guillermo Castilleja, you know, Guillermo, this is so difficult. Why are we continuing this? It doesn't seem like it's going to work. And he said, you know, Tom, it is really difficult, but if we can complete this, we'll look back upon it as one of the most important things we did in our lives. And we did complete that fund. And I've since then worked on a number of others. And I felt that every time, which is what all of you, I think, know, which is the sense of completion, the sense that you've done something that will help conservation into perpetuity. And that is one of the main reasons why conservation trust funds exist, right? And that there is funding needed far into the future. And many activities that we can work on in conservation seem ephemeral, right? They seem like they're temporary. But this line of work is not. This is what brings durability. And I think as we see all the changes, not all of which are good in the world, occurring and affecting nature, we need to be very focused on durability. And some of the things that I did here when my audio was working, particularly in the last two talks, was about that. And I think bringing the strands together of climate and of the relationship between conservation and local communities is absolutely essential for the relevance of conservation trust funds and of conservation finance. And that is the way in which there will be more money available, right? And I think Brian made that point really well. You know, all of us want to have a minimum of 30% land and ocean in conservation. But we also know that for governments to make those decisions, they need the confidence that funding will be there, right? And so, and this is where conservation trust funds come in. And I've worked mostly on the specific type called project finance for permanence. And those there are not as many of those, there are only 5 in existence, but there are more being worked on. One of the things that I'm working on right now with some partners is how we could create many, many more PFPs, and that how do you get over the problem of each one being built case by case. You have to every time creating the team, doing the fundraising, it takes years, right? So how do we accelerate and cut through the transaction costs? And you know, the belief and the theory that we have is that if we have a large enough focused team that can work globally in multiple countries at the same time, then many PFPs can be created simultaneously. And so that is a great hope I've got. And I know that I share that hope with some of my fellow panelists. And it's something that we're working on very specifically right now. And one of the areas where it's most needed, of course, is marine. And that marine is not only behind terrestrial in terms of designations, it's far behind in terms of conservation finance, right? And so, and one of the areas where I see on land some real opportunity for additional financing, and I think this was hit on by Carlos Manuel, who I did hear, was, you know, he mentioned RED+. And I think that we need to make the case more powerfully than we have to date that the large carbon stores that are in large intact ecosystems are absolutely essential for maintaining a climate that we can all survive in. And that, you know, RED has gone toward degraded ecosystems, which is understandable because of additionality. However, we're in a world that is in such flux that I think that the large ecosystems that hold such massive amounts of carbon, they're not something that can just be ignored, which is what has happened to date, really, in the climate talks, and that we need to work now to secure those. And of course, many of those areas are either managed or owned by indigenous and local communities. So that's a big area that I think conservation trust funds and conservation finance must move into, is what kind of changes need to be made to mechanisms as we work with indigenous groups. Because it is a whole, it's not an entirely new set of stakeholders, but it's a different way of working. And it's a different, it is not just through national governments, which is the main way in which we've worked to date, because many of these indigenous groups, particularly in certain countries, are autonomous, right? And they are, as in Canada, First Nations. And so that is an area that I know that some of my colleagues here and I are thinking a lot about, is how do you secure some of the large intact ecosystems, particularly those that are owned and managed by indigenous groups and that can benefit them in a direct economic way. I probably talked longer than I was supposed to, Melissa, so I apologize.
That's okay. I think we're going to turn to the general Q&A in a moment, but before we do that, I'd just like to ask Brian to build on what you discussed relative to the potential for PFP to meet the 30 by 30 goals. Brian, could you just give us a short comment on that?
Sure. I think that Tom's remarks were great, that if we are to build on the 30 by 30 goal, we not only need to adequately finance the existing protected areas, which as you know better than anyone, all of you who are at the front lines of this, that we are underfunding the current protected area system, but we need to then think about new mechanisms. The project finance for permanence effort that Tom mentioned is a critical one, and we're seeing more governments and more private donors coming together to work together to do that. We also saw last week a new effort launched by the German government called the Legacy Landscapes Fund. Many of you are funded by KfW in Germany, and they have launched a new initiative together with some private philanthropists to try to endow and provide long-term funding for some of the world's most biodiverse areas on the planet. So that's critical. And then we need to find new mechanisms, as well as that Tom mentioned, I think, that can finance land tenure and secure indigenous territories, because I think I completely agree with what Tom said, that if we are to get to 30 by 30, it can't just be through parks, it has to be through a number of new ways, and indigenous land tenure is a great way to also help secure biodiversity and reach that 30 by 30 goal.
Great, Brian. You actually raised an issue that I hope we would discuss, which is how can funds support local communities and indigenous peoples? I know that we have some examples, and in fact, the first PFP deal was for the Great Bear Rainforest, and in fact, MACP was involved in that. We have the Community Conservation Fund of Namibia, which supports extension services for conservancies in Namibia. And then we have a new fund under development in the Northern Great Plains to support tribes in that region. I'm wondering if any of the panelists would care to comment on this question of, what's different about funds that support Indigenous peoples and local communities. And don't all speak at once. So if you want to speak, please raise your hand. But I'd love it if we could address this topic. And don't be shy. I see Jason, go ahead.
Well, I'll offer one angle on this. It's obviously something we look at Margaret A. Cargo Philanthropies, because community is at the core of what we're supporting. But going back to my experiences in some of the financing deals like Forever Costa Rica, it was really focused very much on strict protected areas where you could do financial modeling of what it costs to create a new protected area and what it costs to cover ongoing management. When you start to bring community aspects into the model, the financial planning of it needs a serious reboot. And I might be able to pass it to a couple of the other panelists who have actually played in that space. But I think one of the interesting things that has to happen is that the financial modeling behind these long-term deals has to evolve greatly when you start thinking about community being a big part of it. And it's a direction we are going in and have to go in. So those of you who are knee deep in that maybe could respond.
Anyone want to tackle that? That looks like Tom.
Yeah, I think this is an area of experimentation, and that it is so new. And what's really clear to me, though, is that there are some aspects of Indigenous conservation that you can financially model into perpetuity. So, for instance, the Guardians model, which Australia has and Canada has a nascent system of, and that is something that federal governments can be responsible for and should be responsible for. Some of the more economic, and that brings a lot of economic benefits, right? In those communities where there are such low populations for such vast areas, and then beyond that, I think it is the model from Great Bear, which was helping set up eco enterprises. And the PFP that's been under development in Chile was looking at exactly that with gateway communities. And, I'm involved in a discussion in Canada on with Indigenous groups and their aspirations, which have to do with how do they set up sustainable businesses. What's needed from the conservation finance mechanism is small amounts of like revolving loans, right? And so how do you build that into the funds? And what they did, of course, in Great Bear was a hybrid model of a sinking fund that was specifically for that. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And it's shown to, in that case, it created 1,000 permanent jobs, right? And in other cases that you could look at, like in Northwest Territories in Canada, I think it's probably going to be something similar to that. And I think you can model, well, how many years does it take for it to be successful? How many years do you need for a threshold economies of scale, enough businesses to actually get up on their feet, right? And I think that starts to bring in skills that usually we don't have, which are about analyzing the prospects for local businesses, right? And I think that one of probably the area of innovation that we need the most is going beyond the normal partners in conservation to those who have some different experiences in establishing businesses in very rural areas. And that is something that I know I'm looking into, and maybe you guys are as well, but it's not something that the normal conservation finance donors have necessarily worked on.
I think Adriana wanted to, let's give a quick answer, and I really would like to turn to some questions from the audience after this. Go ahead, Adriana.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add, because I think there is a lot, kind of a collective experience, at least in the funds in Latin America, working with local communities. Because in Latin America, we have inside the protected areas, indigenous and non-indigenous communities, and the funds have been working with them throughout their lives. So I think that's the aspect that Tom mentioned in relation to generating jobs and the long-term trends and investing on business in these communities is one aspect that we already have, some localized experience, but can be a galvanizing force to attract investments. So I think that's an area that I think we should really look at the current experiences and the different methodologies that the funds are applying to finance these local communities in their partnership. Another aspect that we are experimenting, at least in the Amazon, is looking at governance mechanisms for these large landscapes and what we call mosaics of areas, where you have protected areas, indigenous lands, areas where you have integral protection, areas where we have communities inside, and including also not only the landscape, but also the waterscapes that in the Amazon are highly relevant. And how you manage these very large tracts of lands and rivers collectively with innovative governance that involves the participation of the indigenous peoples associations, the traditional population associations, local governments, and local NGOs. I think this wealth of experience should be synthesized and applied in this new challenge that we have. Thank you.
Thanks. So now we're going to turn to some questions from the audience, and I have gotten word that we can go over a little bit on the Q&A. I hope that's okay for the panelists. So let's keep our answers short and snappy so we can address as many questions as possible. And those of you in the audience, please feel free in English, French, or Spanish to submit your questions, or even in Portuguese, since we have a Brazilian on the line. The first question we have is from Sebastian Musalem, excuse the pronunciation, who is from Salta, Argentina, from the Subnational System of Protected Areas. And he asks, what experiences can you share to begin a fund? And what financial sources are there to begin one? I think the grant makers in the audience, among the panel, may be able to answer this question. So, Jason, I know that you've supported, or MACP has supported new funds, as has the Moore Foundation, your previous employer. Would you care to just give some guidance?
I can start with some. I mean, I think as funders, when we have looked at these deals, there are a lot of initial ingredients or criteria that we look for to sort of suggest that there's a real opportunity for success. And I think one of those key ingredients is there a serious government commitment to the target for whatever the fund is. So is there a clear target, and is there real political will behind it? I think that's a starting point. As private donors, we also, of course, look for what mechanism is going to get set up if it's a new conservation trust fund. What is going to be the independent vehicle that's going to drive this? Most private funders don't want to put their monies through government. So how does such a fund get set up appropriately to be governed sort of free and independent from political decisions? Those are some of the early starting points, but Tom or anyone else, do you want to weigh in as well? The list gets long fast.
I do, Jason. In Latin America, we have been using JEF funds, who are allocation to national governments, and seed funds to start this arrangement with private donors, bilateral donors, and that has been a successful arrangement throughout Latin America. And we have tried it in Argentina, but never got through it. So Sebastian, if you're an ally, we can talk about that separately. But that has been a very strong element of joining these national allocations that the JEF have. And now we are starting to use the GCF as the convening element of the private funds and the bilateral donor funds from countries. That has been crucial to that.
Great, thanks so much. So another question from Marilyn Valverde, Mar en Comercio and Cell Cargo from Punta Morales, Costa Rica. What do you think could be strategies to involve the private sector into investing in conservation, moving forward from the basic greenwashing social responsibility narrative and actually get involved in conservation holistically? Anyone want to tackle that one? Looks like Brian's on.
Sure. I mean, you could sense a little skepticism from the question itself, and I have to say I share it. The private sector has had, as Carlos Manuel said, we've talked about this for decades, about the private sector funding conservation, and there's very few private companies that fund conservation just out of the goodness of their hearts. There are a few of them that do, but it's a small percentage. If we are to really move private sector finance into conservation, it's going to make governments have to require that across the board. They need to look at it in terms of incentives, in terms of fees, in terms of approaches. Right now, if we're just always pushing on them to say, please, please, please give some of your profits to conservation, I think we're going to have a very small pot of private financing for conservation. So as the Paulson studies showed, that if we are to truly unlock private capital into conservation, governments actually have to lead the way by creating those regulations, creating those fees, creating those structures, and those incentives for the private sector to come forward. So I think we should be talking to our governments, how can we create that structure, rather than all of us kind of asking companies to do this and to give some of their profits to conservation, because I think that's a losing case going forward. That's my 2 cents on this.
So I'd like to just follow up on this question and ask Adriana to speak to Brazil's experience with compensation or biodiversity offsets, because that's an example that Carlos Manuel Rodriguez brought up. And as some people know, I mean, Biofund in Mozambique has also had this experience where regulation has been developed. But Adriana, can you speak to this? And you might also reference Colombia's experience with their carbon tax.
No, I think, as I mentioned on Carlos Manuel, he gave us a great intro into this discussion. We have experimented here in Fumbio, must have shared these experiences with REDLAC on using the CTFs, particularly Fumbio, for implementation, what in Brazil, the biodiversity offsets are called compensation funds. And again, I highlight the importance of working at the subnational level, because there are levels. You even have municipal compensation funds depending on the level of the impact of the particularly private sector investment. And I think in this sense, the funds are uniquely positioned, particularly because of the technical expertise, the strong staff that we're having today in these funds as they, increase their capacity, because they provide a very good service to companies that have no expertise in complex biodiversity conservation projects, and to the governments in a way of receiving these funds. Of course, this sometimes get a little bit difficult with these political shifts, but I think this is an important niche. Mozambique is doing that and has experienced that. I think it enables the institution and get the institution on the dialogue of these large private sector companies. I think that's an interesting entry point in the dialogue. But also this needs to be done with a lot of care and transparency, given that as was mentioned, usually biodiversity offsets are the last resort in terms of impact of large private sector investments on biodiversity. But I think FUNPIO has done a wonderful job, particularly at the state level in Rio, Pará, and other areas. Pará is in the Amazon, Rio is in the Atlantic forest. Colombia became, really a leader in South America with the carbon tax. They used, I was also cited the example of Costa Rica, and the carbon tax in Colombia is one of the revenue streams for Herencia Colombia, and that is very important in the PFP because a lot of the PFP relies on government budgets for the long term, and particularly the uptake of the permanence of the funds, because we're transforming these endowment funds into sinking funds and looking at the long term. For example, what we are going through here in Brazil right now with this political spouse is the reduction of government budgets for conservation. So that's something we need to take into account. This instability, we're learning that in the PFP mechanism. So when you define a policy like the carbon tax in Colombia that is a strong revenue, it's much more durable. So I think, and stable. So I think this is something for the donors to push on the side of government, a permanent stream of revenue that's other than the government budgets. That could be, like a direct learning that we have had over the years with PFPs, and the next generation of PFPs should definitely incorporate that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. We have a question from Valdemar Andrade from Belize, Turneth Atoll Sustainability Association. The question is, we have a financing gap in MPA management, and it has been exacerbated by the pandemic. How do we bridge financing processes at this time with the urgency we need to maintain the capacities we've already built? I'm wondering if Tom, who has been focusing on MPA financing, could address this question.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the main areas where the conservation community, including the conservation finance community, hasn't made a strong enough case is on the economic value of these systems. And, Brian had referenced that recent McKinsey study, which was helpful at a global level of making the case, but we really need this more at the national level. And I think that ties into the point about private sector financing, and that if governments, and particularly finance ministries, better understood the economic value, I think they would then be more amenable to helping set up the types of processes that are needed to pull in the private sector. And the United States, which may be an outlier in many ways, but I think is a case in point, where a recent study showed that the US National Park System brings in $100 billion with a B, dollars a year for an economic revenue for local economies. Well, that helped to get a recent law passed in this country where there's a massive backlog of maintenance and management, and we were able to get a $6.5 billion injection from the federal government, and it was based on the study showing that, well, look how valuable it is, and so it was bipartisan support for it. And I think that's something that we should all take to heart in every country in the world, is looking at the economic value and doing that more systematically. But on marine areas, we're involved in a partnership called the Blue Nature Alliance, and it is with Conservation International, co-implemented with Conservation International, and funded also with partners, including the GEF, the Minderoo Foundation, and the Walton Family Foundation. And that, we decided in that initiative to go beyond designation of new MPAs. And the reason for it is because MPAs are suffering much more than terrestrial areas from this problem of lack of management, right? And so this initiative, which has a very lofty goal of trying to get 18 million square kilometers of effective conservation in place in the ocean. And we expect it to work with 60 countries. So it's a global initiative, is looking at new designations, but it's also very much looking at at management and innovation around management, including innovation around conservation finance. And the reason for that is because governments are not going to be designating a lot of new MPAs unless we start getting management up in the water to a much greater degree than we have today. And we need to focus on the economics behind it. And I thought the McKinsey study was good in terms of looking at the value of fisheries vis-a-vis MPAs and tourism. Those aren't the only two areas, but those are two good ones to start with, right, for any MPA. And that we know that well-run MPAs are fish factories, right? They are providing more fish, and that can be calculated as to what the value is. And those are good arguments we can make both to industry and to governments.
Thanks, Tom. So I'm going to run through a few of these questions kind of rapid fire. And I'd like to address a question posed by Alexer Vasquez. What currently motivates the private sector to grant resources for these funds? How can someone justify the use of private resources for conservation projects? Quick answer from someone? Brian?
Associations here in the US, there's a thing called 1% for the planet. We've got a lot of the outdoor industry does it, and there becomes pressure within the sector. So clothing companies, if Patagonia is donating 1% and North Face is, it gets other clothing companies to want to also join in. So I would say peer pressure from in the sector and creating those associations that have an expectation to do that. I know in India, there is a requirement that a certain percentage of profits go towards philanthropy. So those are some things to look at. I would say getting the associations to them to have a universal standard. So one that gives to the private, one private company that gives to conservation isn't an outlier. It becomes the norm within the sector.
Great. Craig Henry from the St. Lucia National Trust Conservation Fund writes, what are some ways that CTFs can convince governments, or especially small island developing states, who are reluctant to divert more support to finance natural conservation efforts, especially in debt swap arrangements, which have enormous potential? I'm going to pick someone. Go ahead, Tom.
I'll make one point on that, which is that look at the nearby country in Bahamas, where the study that showed the value of shark conservation to the country, and that I'm going to try and remember the number, but wasn't it $250 million a year? 200? It was a very high. I have to find the study again, but that specific study was marshaled a lot of support, right? Not only in the Bahamas, but in marine conservation elsewhere, and saying, okay, and something that's not thought of by central governments, which is sharks, actually has a big economic value, and particularly in rural areas, and helps with other kinds of social benefits, including, preventing rural to urban flight and so forth. And anyway, I think these kinds of specific economic studies, like the shark study in the Bahamas, are actually really beneficial to making your argument.
Mm-hmm. James, are you wanting us to wrap up? I think I heard you.
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind wrapping up, thank you, Melissa. It wasn't me, but as you ask.
Okay. I think unfortunately, we are going to have to wrap up. We have some more questions. And I apologize for the technical issues. But I would like to have each one of our speakers just say a final word about what inspires you about conservation trust funds. And I do mean a word or two. Go ahead, Jason.
Well, this kind of links back to several of the questions that were about how do you attract funding, private or public. And I guess the word I'd leave you with is what's underappreciated about conservation trust funds is their potential to leverage. Keep leveraging and attracting multiple players to the party.
Hey, Tom.
Yeah, I think it's that this is an answer to the question of durability, and which is absolutely key.
Adriana?
I would say keep the passion and the innovation. And I think someone in the panel comment, we need to make conservation finance as an integral part of economic development. And I think it's Dr. Gillian that was in the side in the comments. And I think that's a very important thought that to be left here. Thank you.
And Brian.
What gives me inspiration is the people who run them, all of you at RedLac and Cafe and your trust funds. Trust funds aren't just an abstract concept. They're a collection of individuals, and you are all incredibly passionate defenders and advocates for nature conservation. And so I would say keep that passion and that inspiration, because your advocacy is effective, and that's what raises the money. That's what gets this done. So that's what inspires me, is the people who lead these CTFs.
I'd just like to wrap up by thanking the panelists and thanking RedLac and Cafe, and particularly with Stenka and Karen. And my final word is just to say that I miss you all. I think all of us feel that RedLac and Cafe, it's more than just a technical meeting. We honestly miss the in-person contact more than for any other meeting I can think of. So best wishes to everyone, and good luck, and over to you, James.
Thank you so much, everyone. That was really an excellent panel. And unfortunately, we do have to wrap up, as in just over 20 minutes, we have the next panel coming up. That's 9:30 a.m. Costa Rica time. Impact investment, private sector, and conservation. So very relevant to the conversation that's already been had. To join that session, you will need to leave this webinar, go back to the event platform and rejoin. It will be a new webinar, so this one will be ending shortly. And that's not it, because at 11 a.m. Costa Rican time, so in a few hours, there will be a final session for today, Green Development Fund, building a regional financing platform for ecosystem restoration. And that session will be held in Spanish. And those are the two remaining sessions for today, but of course there will be plenty more sessions tomorrow and the day after also. So thank you for bearing with us while we had those technical issues, and we'll see you in 20 minutes for the next session. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.